Water brought most of our ancestors to this continent. And water took them westward into it. Water was their road to freedom and sometimes riches, their source of inspiration and adventure. That's also true on a boat named Driftwood for a group of young Americans and Canadians right out of college. Over a 3-year period, they covered 25,000 miles along the waterways of North America, from Nova Scotia to the Gulf of Mexico. A professional crew operated the boat while teams of young people documented the journey. Among them, Bill Arnold from Mohawk College in Hamilton, Ontario. Tom Miller, a graduate of the University of Florida.
All right, now what?
And Brandy Spear from the University of Georgia. Travel with them to visit the places and meet the people they discovered along the way. Like a remote island where crab is king. A man who's living the life he dreamed of as a child. And a place where people have ridden the wind since the beginning of flight. Join the crew of the Driftwood on their voyage up the South Atlantic from Florida to the Chesapeake. Fort Lauderdale, where the boys are, where the girls are. The city is called the Venice of America because of its hundreds of miles of canals. Fort Lauderdale is the yachting capital of the world, harboring more than 40,000 boats each year. It's created a whole economy, marine supplies, boat yards, and deep-sea fishing.
They've seen pictures of people bringing in huge marlin and sailfish and swordfish and everything, and they want to go out there and try it themselves. The people who are lucky enough to catch a sailfish, most of them aren't going to throw the fish back. We visited a place in Fort Lauderdale called Reese Taxidermist, who specializes in transferring that fish that you caught into a trophy that you can mount on your wall.
Fishermen come to Reese because of its reputation. In fact, fish from all over the country, all over the world, are shipped there.
It's 82.
James Clinton has been at Reese for 42 years.
Well, I do everything. From sculpting of fish to mounting and finishing fish, do anything.
I was surprised to find out how very little of the fish they use. And according to the people who work at Reese, they use more of the fish than anybody else.
All that they keep from the fish basically are some of the bone structures of the nose and snout and a couple of the fins and the skin. And they build a fish around the skin. Basically what you have when you're done is just a model with the same dimensions and the skin of the fish that you caught. To me, it seems kind of ludicrous. If I were going to catch one of those big fish that have been living in the ocean for a long time, I'd rather bring it in and hold it next to me and take a picture than let it live.
But James Clinton, whose entire working life has been devoted to making trophies, disagrees.
Oh, a picture is nothing like the real sailfish. Oh, it's just like, hey, a picture's no good. You got a real sailfish that you caught, that's something you caught yourself.
On reflection, the Driftwood crew had some feelings about what they'd seen. They didn't question the skill of the artists. They just wondered if they had been witness to an anachronism.
It might mean a little more if you were to tape yourself or have someone tape you while you're reeling the fish in. and fighting it and actually confronting the fish itself and then bringing it out of the water, showing your catch, and then releasing it back into the water.
It makes you mad because there's no need to kill the fish. It's not like you're going to eat it. It's like going out and big game hunting in Africa. When you see this big, beautiful elephant walking along and you kill it. And then you have some head on your wall to show your friends and feed your ego.
But there's more than one way to stuff a fish. They discovered that traveling up Florida's Gold Coast to the playground of the rich, Palm Beach. They stopped at a landmark that's been there for almost a century, the Breakers Hotel.
One of the things that the Breakers is known for is their food. Very fine cuisine, very good cooking. So we thought it'd be interesting to interview one of the chefs at the Breakers. His name is Scott.
The thing with Scott Gilbert is that he has been the chef de cuisine at the Breakers for 2.5 years now. He's been working as a chef for 11 years.
And he was real serious about it. He had to be serious. I mean, anybody that would stay in a kitchen that's 110 degrees for 8 hours a day to cook a meal for somebody else to eat, then they have to be pretty serious.
I guess you have to love what you're doing.
I think it's about 6 or 7 for each order.
And for me, it's artistic and it's enjoyable. I like to use only what's fresh that season, what's in.
We just want to warm them up.
His youth surprised me. Because when you think of a chef, I picture someone with a lot older. And when I saw him, I said, man, he's a couple of years older than me.
And then we'll put that right there.
The entree Scott's proudest of is a dish he calls Turbot of Grouper Palm Beach. For that, he won the title of Florida's Seafood Chef of the Year.
It's a turbot because of the way that it's folded. In designing this dish, we decided to utilize indigenous items to Florida. The sauce is made with fresh papaya and orange juice. And we have chives to give a little bit of an onion flavor.
He'll get together with his chefs and mix various foods together to see what they taste like. The turbot of grouper is a culmination of his desire to have high nutrition, which can be found in the beans and the grouper, and also keep a lot of food that's indigenous to Florida in there as well.
Have a nice evening. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you.
The Breakers was something different for the crew. The driftwood is comfortable and practical, but it's no luxury hotel. It's a working boat.
And you got bars.
As it headed up Florida's intracoastal waterway, driftwood picked up some driftwood, a big submerged log courtesy of a careless developer. It got caught in the prop, so they had to stop for repairs before heading on to a working port, Jacksonville. Jacksonville is the 11th largest container port in the world. Much of the citrus fruit shipped from Florida passes through here. 66-year-old Willie McLaughlin has been loading and unloading the ships along the waterfront most of his life.
My father taught me longshore work. I worked on the hull with him when I was trying to finish high school.
When he started, Willie's wages were 35 cents an hour. Today, he makes $18 an hour. He's seen a lot of changes along these docks in the last 44 years. Many were made possible by the Longshoremen's Union his father helped establish back in 1939. Then as now, most of the members were black.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I'll tell you why it is. I don't have to think about it. You know, like I said, and years ago, when you had to pick up 160 pounds of coffee, the white boy didn't want that, you know. But now, you don't have to do this. I mean, he can take a pencil and go and join the checkers local, and he can go there and check that container, you know what I mean? Or he can go on the ship with me and pick up those sharks. And the chalk only weighs about 4 or 5 pounds or 3 or 4 pounds, where a bag of coffee used to weigh 160 pounds.
So the white guys didn't want to do the work?
No. Would you want to pick up 160 pounds?
Well, that's you and who?
Life of a longshoreman begins extremely early in the morning. They're up before the sun even rises. They gather themselves together and then go down in the union hall in anticipation of hopefully working that day.
I was just across the street.
It's called a shape-up. They all get together and decide who's going to do what.
There's an interesting system that they have there. It works alphabetically from like A to, I believe, I. A, people get the top jobs. If you're at I, you're lucky if you even get a job maybe once a week.
A man who has been in the organization as long as I have an A card.
And that means he gets first shot at the top jobs on the docks each day.
I used to carry bananas, and the bananas were not in boxes, they were in stems. And we used to put them on our shoulder. But now you don't see a banana stem. Bananas are put in boxes, and the boxes are put in containers in refrigeration.
So you may unload an entire ship and not even know what's in it.
That's definitely.
Do you know what we unloaded yesterday?
Yes, I know that the white containers came out of Argentina, South America, and they ship a lot of shrimp and fish, some type of fish. And coffee is supposed to be in some of the other containers, but God knows, we never know.
When will he retire? Well, not just yet. Willie rather enjoys it that he's become a fixture there.
And everybody on the riverfront knows me. Young people like you all, I'm training each day. The riverfront has been good to me.
Jacksonville was Driftwood's last stop in Florida. They headed north on the Intracoastal Waterway toward Savannah, passing the Golden Isles. Places like Cumberland Island, long the home of a herd of wild horses. Jekyll Island, once the playground of the Astors, Rockefellers, and Morgans. And St. Simon's Island, where the British built a fort before the American Revolution.
I've lived in Georgia all my life, and I've been to the coast a lot, but I never knew that there were so many riches there. And when I came back down on the boat, I got a chance to see it from a different perspective.
Then the Driftwood headed inland to the port of Savannah.
We spent some time early one morning when the fog was coming in. And it's like you were transformed back to the early 1800s.
Savannah sits on a large river about 18 miles from the ocean. Paper, pulp, and minerals bring money into the port these days, but in earlier times it was cotton, rice, sugar, and indigo that made fortunes for southern plantation owners and made Savannah a major seaport, a rich and elegant place. But this graceful southern city hit a series of major setbacks in the 19th century. The Civil War, epidemics of yellow fever and cholera, then the final blow, the fall of cotton prices in 1895. Savannah's most beautiful homes gave way to decay. But for some people, disaster represents opportunity. One of those people is Ann Osteen. She found an old wreck of a warehouse on the waterfront.
When I saw this building, I knew it was special. It was the cheapest waterfront property in Savannah. And I thought, well, why hasn't anybody thought about the Savannah riverfront?
So what's happened here?
Well, it's boomed. It's the oldest cotton wheel still left in America.
Ann Osteen's warehouse was by no means the first to be renovated in Savannah. Some believe the movement started years ago when a British aristocrat, Lady Astor, visited the city and found it in a state of disrepair.
She said, "Oh, this is such a gorgeous city," but she's a beautiful lady with a dirty face. And oh, it enraged people at the times. Sometimes it's good to shake people up, you know. It makes them realize, because in the early 50s, 6 ladies of the city learned that the famous Davenport House was going to be torn down, which is considered by many to be one of the finest federal houses in America.
The plans were to raise the house and build a parking lot. The original group of 6 ladies was joined by others, and the house was spared.
The fact that they were able to save that house and preserve it kind of sent out a signal that that's the way we want to go here.
And they did. House after house fixed up and painted. That's of particular interest to Anne. She's an artist specializing in fabrics, jewelry, and painting. She used her talents to help change the face of her city.
It was just a natural for me to say, well, you know, as an artist, you've got to paint up your buildings, and you've got to have some sort of spectrum of colors and some rhyme or reason to make this puzzle fall together and fit.
She contributed her knowledge of the paints that were originally used in some of those homes. What she ended up having to do was to actually flake off old paint and send it off to have it studied.
Georgia Peach Leather House. I took the name from the color of the candy. That's an old slave recipe. That's a mixture of lots of granulated sugar, which we have abundance because we grow so much sugar cane here, and apricot nectar and peach juice, good old Georgia peach juice.
As a result of her research into historic paints, the decor of the city is returning to its original look.
The average tourist or person visiting Savannah may not drive by one of these restored houses and go, "Oh, that's an indigo blue. That's the exact color that they used 200 years ago." It's that kind of detail, though, that is important to people like Anne Olstein.
I just feel good about the fact that even though most people don't know what they're seeing, that these beautiful old ladies, you know, have their original makeup on once again. I just feel like I've helped her get dressed again, you know, and ready to go to the ball, so to speak.
And so the Driftwood crew learned a bit about preserving one's heritage. It was something they would see time and time again on this part of their journey. And it was a theme that was about to take some surprising turns as the boat moved north. Along the coast of Georgia and South Carolina are tiny masses of land known as the Sea Islands. All of them have colorful pasts, with tales of pirate coves, shipwrecks, and Revolutionary War battles. They aren't far apart, most of them just a few miles offshore, a boat trip away from each other. But from island to island, the people and their cultures can be drastically different. Hilton Head in South Carolina is the largest. It was once dominated by prosperous rice and cotton plantations. In the 1950s, developers bought up most of the island.
Hilton Head has now been turned into a resort with a lot of golf courses and things like that.
I guess if you like golf, it's wonderful because they've got some great golf courses. But it just seemed like they had destroyed so much of the natural environment that it was really a shame.
Less than a mile away from Hilton Head is Defusky Island. But that short distance is deceptive because the differences between the two islands make it seem like they are worlds apart. One of the things that makes Defusky so different is Gullah, a language indigenous to the Sea Islands spoken between the residents. It mixes African words and syntax with English.
Gullah is an African-American language.
Ron and Natalie Days have dedicated their lives to saving the Gullah language and culture. Ron learned Gullah as a boy growing up on an island near Defusky. Now he and Natalie are passing on the language to others, like this class of youngsters in Defusky Island's only school.
It swims in the crab, live in the creek.
In the days of slavery, the Gullah language had a distinct purpose.
Gullah was used to confound white listeners. The Gullah men make swim snap for him for sale. When him see such a sight, long as him live, him will tell. 7 snake drop from the tree with him been a net. Him yell, "Great day," and run from where him been a set. Can you get a translation?
Okay, translation. The Gullah was netting a shrimp net to sell. When he saw such a sight, as long as he lives, he will tell. 7 snakes dropped from the tree where he was sitting. He yelled, "Great day," and ran from where he was netting.
This language is being lost. And there's a lot of mixed feelings about it. Some people don't want the Gullah language anymore because they see it as being a very negative thing towards their culture. Yet other people see it as part of their heritage, and they want to preserve it, and that's where Ron and Natalie come in.
It's important to me because for so long, the Gullah-speaking people of the Sea Islands of both South Carolina and Georgia, or Geechees as we are also called, saltwater Geechees, have been given a negative stereotype that we have made no contributions to American culture or to the worldwide culture, and we have.
To prove that, Ron and Natalie make their living performing a traveling show they call Sea Island Montage. They tell folk stories from the Gullah culture and sing spirituals using the language.
I'm gonna sit at the welcome table. Some of our songs were used as coded messages. There were religious songs with religious themes, and lots of times when others heard us singing them, they thought we were always referring to heaven, someplace in the sky, not being able to wait until we got there. But when we sang about heaven or when we sang about home, those words referred to freedom, home in Africa, heaven being someplace where there was no slavery. That was heaven for us.
Defusky Island was that place once, when freed slaves owned much of the land. But now the black population has dwindled. 2 elegant resorts have opened, and with them come exclusive golf courses and expensive vacation homes. Land values have gone sky high, and so have taxes. Meanwhile, oysters and cotton, once the main source of income on the island, have been killed off by pollution and blight.
And a lot of the residents who've been there for a lifetime, for a number of generations, can't live anymore. So what's happening, they're either staying and trying to weather out the problem with that, or else they're just selling their land.
There is a certain degree of inevitability to the development. Developers say that they bring in jobs, and they do. The downside is that frequently the jobs for native Gullah speakers, native islanders, are the menial jobs.
And in addition to what Natalie said, some developers have the concept of their developments as the return to the old South.
Yes.
And from my knowledge of history, that's nothing that I want to return
I don't want to go back, yeah.
And what's going to happen, I think, if allowed to take its current course, is Defusky Island will eventually be another Hilton Head, which is kind of sad to me because there's plenty of places like Hilton Head, but there's nothing else in the whole world like Defusky Island.
The Driftwood headed north to Beaufort, North Carolina. It was here that Brandy Spear ended his time on board Driftwood. In his place came Kevin Lillestall from the Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University.
One of the really things that sets Beaufort in my mind was the houses were just beautiful. Every porch had a couple rockers on them, old weathered rockers.
One of the true landmarks in town is not a place, but a gentleman by the name of Graydon Paul.
And it's been standing right there since 1812. Well, I've got to tell you a little story about that Confederate soldier. We had the coldest spell of weather here this past January that's ever been recorded in the annals of the Weather Bureau in Raleigh, North Carolina. It got so cold that that Confederate soldier dropped that musket and put his hands in his pocket.
Right now, he's nearly blind, he's going deaf, and yet his mind is still as young as ever. And it's really neat to sit down and listen to the stories that he has to tell.
Well, the Yankee soldiers cut the trees down in the backyard and dragged them in the front room and cut them up for firewood to burn in the fireplaces. Such, of course, was the atrocities of war.
And the bus tour is you really get a sense of what the town is all about and how old it is.
Anyway, North Carolina has never hung but 3 people in the 275 years of its history. And I want to tell you about those 3 people.
Graydon says he got to know so much about Beaufort just by listening to his daddy and granddaddy talk. And he's not shy about regaling an audience with tales of his own history, 91 years in the making.
Beaufort was a very quaint old town back in the days when I was growing up, because the front street was not even paved. The tide rose and fell across Front Street right up the houses that were on the north side of the street. And I was married the 6th day of August, just 12 days after I was 21 years old. And that's another miracle in itself. Been married to that same woman ever since. When King Lot stoppers were stacked days high, when the booze-yacht ran ashore.
You never did get on the key.
Well, I'd sing it off key then.
You sure were.
Now let me take a taste of this drink.
All right, now get on the key this time.
Well, honey, you know I don't hear very good.
One of the things Graydon and MC had in common from the very beginning was a love of vaudeville.
Well, my wife and I put on shows in the theaters, talent night shows, you know, like they used to do. And we had what we called a showboat that we ran up and down Core Sound, putting on shows in schoolhouses from Atlantic to Harker's Island. Now, have you got time for the rest of the story about the man who hired the mule
Honey,
train?
they told her that they told you they didn't want the stories today. They're going to get the stories tomorrow.
Oh, what do I do now?
Nothing. Sit down.
Sit down? The
But
show's
listen,
over?
honey, please.
Graydon did other things for a living, too. He worked as a blacksmith and a machinist, and eventually he opened his own business right on the water. Then World War II broke out.
Well, the U-boats did operate pretty close off the coast of North Carolina during World War II. And I was mayor of Beaufort in 41 and 42, and that also made me chairman of civilian defense. So we had to go out there at night and patrol and see if the light blackout was properly carried out in this town, you see.
And frequently there were explosions off the coast as the German subs and the American ships fought it out. Graydon remembers one time he had to help bring in the wounded.
And the men had to jump overboard in the water, and then by that time the fire had spread on the water and they just had to swim right through that burning oil.
The thing that I liked about him was you get to hear about the history of Beaufort from somebody who was there the whole time.
And he is so highly regarded that city leaders have named a park after him. And a bridge as well. For his part, Graydon has written a book about the Beaufort area, including history and folk songs and original poetry.
He just broke into this poem that he had written himself. It's really nice, all about the Taylor Creek that he lives on.
You know, on a calm and peaceful morning, when the wind is from the land, Taylor's Creek is one big mirror, reflecting trees and marsh and sand. So I look beyond my window, out the Beaufort Inlet Bar, where many ocean ships are sailing with their cargoes from afar. Now, when I finally get to heaven and walk along those golden streets, I hope I'll see some cedar and yoe point, such as grows on Taylor's Creek. Good place to be born, a good place to live, and a good place to die. And that's what I want to do.
Money from the whaling industry helped build Old Beaufort. But when that trade died in the late 1800s, the town turned to other kinds of commercial fishing, including a species called menhaden. It's found in great numbers along the South Atlantic coast. When the driftwood crew went looking for the captain of a menhaden boat, they found Bobby Martin.
You think about a menhaden captain, you're going to think about this old salt of the sea, right? Well, we meet this guy that looks like a yuppie.
But at 32, Bobby Martin's been fishing half his life.
My great-grandfather on my mother's side, he was a real good fisherman, and a lot of my kinfolk tell me that I remind them a lot of him, you know. So I guess, you know, a certain amount of it's got to be in your blood, because that's what a lot of fishing is a lot of, you know, you make a lot of decisions by instinct.
And these days, instinct is helped along by modern technology. Airplanes used to locate schools of fish.
What's weird also is the sense of urgency. I mean, everyone's really quiet on the boat, and everyone's eating and relaxing and having a good time, and then all of a sudden, everyone runs, and everyone moves 100 miles an hour to get these fish in.
We just circle the fish with a big seine. We have a big weight, it's called a tom weight, and we drop that, and it had rings on the bottom of the net, closes the net up.
It's surprising that these guys work with all the automation that they have, with the hydraulic winches that haul the net up, that it is still really labor intensive. And it's fairly tricky on these boats. I mean, these are big, huge steel boats, and they slam into each other quite hard.
And then they carry the whole mess back to the big ship, where they drop a hose in and suck all the fish out and load it onto the big ship. And each catch could be 150,000 pounds.
Bobby Martin made captain when he was only 25, one of the youngest ever in the menhaden business. He had a lot to prove. In his second year out, he caught 75 million pounds of fish, setting an all-time record.
At times I really feel lucky that I've done as well as I have as young as I am, you know. Of course, I guess I worked for it.
He was telling us one of the greatest feelings he ever has is coming back into port with a big catch, because everybody, all the locals know he's gone, you know, and they're all waiting for him to come back.
Protein out of sea.
The process of menhaden hasn't changed in like 75 years. And going to the menhaden factory, it was like you were just opening up a door to the past.
The smell is quite overpowering.
They go into this another area where they're cooked, and so the whole room fills with steam. And there are spider webs right close to the fish, and there are cats wandering around, and there'd be no way you'd eat anything out of that place.
You wouldn't want to anyway, because menhaden is a trash fish. But the oil is used as a health aid and as a fine lubricant.
The body and the bones and everything are dried, and they make fish meal out of that. And that's used for poultry feed, feeding chickens and turkeys and stuff.
The menhaden industry's #1 competitor is soybeans. When the price of soybeans goes down, so does the price of fish meal. Competition like that has forced a lot of menhaden plants out of business. At the turn of the century, there were 7 fishing operations in town. The smell must have been overpowering, because even though Beaufort Fisheries is the only plant left, the stench it emits is causing an uproar. Those trying to develop the town are complaining.
A lot of other people who have been there a long time says the smell is the smell of money. That's what settled the town.
And that would become a refrain heard on the rest of the trip. Old ways versus the issues of development and tourism. The driftwood was headed east to another string of offshore islands known as the Outer Banks. The trip across Pamlico Sound took them through some extremely shallow water.
You can look for miles, and it'd only be 7 feet deep.
And it's full of hazards, like crab pots used by commercial fishermen.
White buoys, orange buoys, every kind of buoy color you can think of to identify, so the crabber can identify his catch. And it makes navigating through the area very difficult.
But those obstacles are minor compared to what ships on the ocean side face. The shoals along the Outer Banks are dangerous, and the currents strong and unpredictable. Even so, in the days of sail, southbound vessels would hug the coast because they could not fight the powerful Gulf Stream that runs offshore. but it was a game of chance. And over the years, there have been hundreds of shipwrecks, earning this stretch of coast a nickname, Graveyard of the Atlantic.
I was amazed at how much the lighthouse has meant to the people there. I guess over the years, they symbolize safety, they symbolize land, they symbolize also dangers, the dangers of the shoals and all the shipwrecks that have happened.
And ironically, those lighthouses which have saved so many ships from the waters of the Atlantic may now be taken over by the ocean. It's a problem all along the Outer Banks, a natural process known as beach retreat. What happens is that when storms wash over the islands, they carry sand from the ocean side over to the sound side. Over hundreds of years, the islands gradually roll over themselves and move toward the west.
When man tries to build a structure such as a lighthouse or a house along the eastern side, they're going to have to contend with the fact that these islands are sort of moving.
A lot of homeowners who thought they could put one over on Mother Nature have had to abandon their expensive oceanfront properties. Others spend even more money to have their homes moved inland. One of the buildings that's been relocated is a place where Wilbur and Orville Wright once stayed. The Young brothers from Ohio chose Kitty Hawk on the Outer Banks for their first experiments in manned flight. It's a place with steady winds and sand for miles around, which meant they could test their invention without too much damage to themselves or the planes. And that's the same reason modern-day aviators flock to the area.
So you think about that while these guys are hang gliding, you know, and it really hits home.
The weather conditions that make for good hang gliding are also ideal for a water sport.
The winds are favorable for first-time windsurfers, beginners, and I think we proved them right.
Students we've ever had.
Kitty Hawk was the last stop in North Carolina. The driftwood was traveling north into an area where much of our nation's early history unfolded, the Chesapeake Bay. It's 200 miles long, cuts right through the state of Virginia, and nearly bisects Maryland as well. The Chesapeake is North America's largest estuary, where salt water from the Atlantic is mixed with fresh water from the many streams that feed the bay. More than 150 creeks empty into it, as well as 9 major rivers, including the James, the Potomac, and the Susquehanna.
I didn't think of the Chesapeake Bay area as a big farming area. You think of fishing and crabbing and things like that, but for generations, people also have been making a living off the land there.
Well, the eastern shore of Virginia is the largest vegetable-producing region in the state of Virginia.
On most of their farm, Art and Marcia Carter grow soybeans. But they always leave at least one field empty, which they seed so that migrating birds will have something to eat in the winter.
How much can you carry?
That's right.
The property has been in Art's family for 4 generations, but his ties to the area go way back.
Enough for you?
Yep.
My earliest ancestor was a gentleman by the name of Pierre Descartes, a Haitian who sailed up the bay with the French, early 1700s. Met an enslaved African lady and had a child by her. We'll just go back and forth. We'll just
Descartes left him behind when he sailed on. Art's ancestors remained in slavery for more than a century until the Civil War broke out in 1861. At age 16, his great-grandfather joined the Union Army.
Of course, the Union soldiers And the Union were the only ones with money after the Civil War. The losers, the Confederates, had no money. The South was bankrupt. And many of the African Americans who served in the Civil War were from this area. And of course, they had money when the war ended, and many men, in addition to my grandfather, bought large tracts of land after the war here.
Many of those families lost their property during the Depression, but the Carter clan managed to hang on to theirs.
And let's see. Well, I see a nice heartbeat. You see that heartbeat, Kim?
Yeah.
In addition to being a farmer, Art Carter is a doctor, one of only 2 obstetricians in the county.
And Kim, I think he's asleep. Yep, there's the thigh.
Medicine is another tradition in Art's family. His father was a surgeon, but was unable to practice on the Eastern Shore because of the color of his skin.
He had to leave Northampton County and go to Alabama and practice medicine there.
So Art spent much of his childhood away from the family farm. But every summer, he'd come back.
My godfather and cousin Bob Treeherne and I would fish out here in the creek and in the bay. And those were my fondest memories as a boy.
He held on to those images all through college at Georgetown in Washington, D.C., where he won a Golden Gloves title and where he met Marcia. After medical school at the University of Cincinnati, Art, Marcia, and their 2 daughters moved back to tiny Nassauwattocks, Virginia. Downtown looks much the way it did when he was a kid. But some things have changed, like the racial climate, so that a couple like Art and Marcia are now accepted.
Well, I like it so much here because of the people here who I find very warm, very friendly to each other. Although, like any rural community, we are a bit, I think, standoffish from outsiders until they've proven or disproven themselves. I'll just share some news, if that's all right.
And there are more and more strangers showing up these days. Retirees in search of cheap property and young couples looking for vacation homes. Art has joined the fight to stop the area from becoming another luxury resort.
Growth is important. Growth is inevitable. Uncontrolled and unmanaged growth, we think, is a death knell, and not only to the county, but to other pristine and beautiful areas like this.
His belief in not messing around with the environment also extends to the way he runs his farm.
I like to hunt, and I know that when I use herbicides and pesticides on my property that the small quail can't get the insects that they need to grow, so my quail population is down. I certainly wouldn't want to do anything that would pollute the watershed and the Chesapeake Bay secondarily.
He pays the price for not using herbicides because you can see among his crop there are lots of weeds. And one field he showed us is gone to waste because of that.
Yeah, in the field, picking out weeds like this, you got to be double food.
The ruined field will cost Art Carter about $1,000, but he says he'll plant it again without pesticides next year.
It's important to him to continue farming that land. It's a way for him to keep up with his heritage.
Art Carter's grandfather and great-grandfather, the Union soldier, are buried in the family cemetery. He's proud of them and of the role the Eastern Shore has played in the nation's history. In addition to being a major agricultural center, the Eastern Shore of Virginia is the most important wintering area on the entire Atlantic coast.
The Chesapeake Bay is geographically positioned for the flight patterns of Canadian geese, of other waterfowl.
And for centuries, hunting has been as much a part of life here as farming or working the water. Grayson Chesser can remember the first time his father took him duck hunting.
I was just like an alcoholic taking the first drink from then on. I mean, I was gung-ho.
Grayson says he knows a lot of people find that hard to understand and will cringe when he says that to him, hunting is not so much a sport as a kind of religion.
You can't explain hunting to anybody who's not done it, really. We've only been living anything even remotely like the way we live now for just a few thousand years, and for tens and tens of thousands before that, we were hunter-gatherers. I think it's just something that's born in you.
The same way that Grayson was born with the talent for carving.
Grayson is one of the top duck decoy carvers in North America and very possibly the world.
To watch him take a block of wood and then turn it into a duck is a pretty cool thing.
When I was a kid, all I ever wanted to be was a goose guide and a decoy carver, but at that time, that was sort of like thinking you're going to grow up and play center field for the Yankees or something.
Instead, he figured he'd make a living the way his father did, as a game warden and hunting guide in the winter and a farmer the rest of the year. And for a long time, that's what Grayson did, until he realized that his hobby, carving, was beginning to pay off.
First, I started making enough to get a bandsaw, and then I made enough to get a shop, and for long I was paying for the groceries. And after a while, I finally realized that it wasn't much need to lose money farming, and that you were making carving decoys.
One thing that I noticed about the decoys is the price on them. They're very expensive.
Grayson's pieces range from $150 to $2,500 each. Most are bought by hunters.
You get to sit there while you're making them, and you can think about them being used, and it's just a lot more fun doing that than thinking about it being made and sitting on a mantle somewhere.
Like many people on the Eastern Shore, Grayson comes from a family that has lived in the area for generations. His ancestors were among the first Europeans to settle here. His wife, Dawn, can trace her roots back to one of the Indian tribes. They live with their daughter in a farmhouse that's 150 years old. Grayson says he never realized how different the Eastern Shore is from the rest of the country until he started traveling to art shows all over the nation.
You take the entire East Coast from Boston until you get to Norfolk is just about developed. And the only reason we're left is because of our isolation. There's nothing we've done to save ourselves. I hope that maybe we can, I don't know.
Like Art Carter, Grayson's attention is focused on how to control development so that the whole area doesn't begin to look like the nearby town of Chincoteague.
Up until the early 60s, Chincoteague was mainly a fishing village. And now their economy is basically tourist-related. I got a friend of mine who lives on the east side who's a waterman and a carver and a hunting guide. I told him, I said, Clark, I said, if you just hang on another 15 years, I said, you'll be well off because they'll be able to charge admission to see you because you'll be the only Chincoteaguer it is left because the typical Chincoteague resident will be a retired psychiatrist from Washington.
In his fight to keep developers out, Grayson finds himself pitted against some longtime friends and neighbors.
They think if you own it hell deep and heaven high, and it's yours to do with whatever you want. But I think it's time we realize that we're just more or less caretakers and that we can't afford to destroy it.
One of the earliest known European visitors to the bay was Captain John Smith. In 1608, he set sail from the newly established settlement at Jamestown in order to map the Chesapeake. Smith described it as the finest place he had ever seen for man's delightful habitation, a waterway teeming with fish, crabs, and oysters. But today, that bounty is in jeopardy. Harvests from many of the commercial fish, such as striped bass, shad, and herring, have fallen dramatically. Oysters have virtually disappeared, down from a high of 20 million bushels to just 2 million. Scientists trace many of the problems to pollution, from the towns and cities on the Chesapeake, from sewage treatment plants, and from farms. A major cleanup effort has been underway since 1983 with mixed results. So far, one creature seems to have escaped the effects of pollution, much to the relief of a little town in Maryland.
As you come into Crisfield, one of the first things you notice is the water tower. It's a working town. You see the stacks and stacks of buckets that are probably holding crabs waiting to be processed.
To be exact, they're holding Chesapeake blue crabs, a variety that is most valuable right after it shed its hard shell. Crisfield is the soft shell capital of the world. And Handy Crab is the biggest processor in town.
There was actually an automatic sorter that would sort the crabs according to weight and kick them out into bins. The long line of women mostly that would sit and snip the lungs out and do all the trimming on them.
They're shipping all over the United States, North America, and internationally to Japan and other countries around the world.
But if the processing of crabs has become high-tech, the harvesting has not. Much of it is still done by individuals like Dave Laird.
I grew right up into it. I went with my father since I was a small boy, say 6, 7, or 8 years old.
There was numerous other crabbers that were using motors to drag the nets in and pull the crabs in. Dave's doing it simply by hand and pure strength.
Well, this is the way I'm doing it, is the way it was done years ago.
And that's important where Dave comes from. Smith Island, Maryland, population 550. It sits in the middle of the Chesapeake, 10 miles east of Crisfield.
But they are dependent on the mainland. That every day they get a shipment. That people have to have their groceries shipped over.
There's nothing fancy about Smith Island. No movie theater or video arcade. And like it's been for generations, nearly everyone here makes a living from the water.
Along the docks of Smith Island, there's a series of shanties where they bring the crabs in.
He has this huge, long shed with floats, and he brings his catch in, dumps them in the floats, and then he has to check them every so many hours to pick out the crabs that have shed their shells.
So how are you splitting those up, Dave?
What I'm doing, these are too soft. I'm gonna get these out in the morning.
Oh, okay. They're too soft?
There's a crab. He'll be a soft shell in the morning.
What's that called?
That's the soft shell. That's the soft shell. He'll be, probably in a couple hours, he'll
So he'll pull out of this whole thing?
That's right.
During crab season, May through October, Dave and his wife Cecil work 7 days a week, up to 16 hours a day. In good years, it's worth it.
Well, I'm my own boss, you know. I'm independent. I do what I want.
But when the driftwood crew visited, he was worried that too many crabs were being caught, glutting the market and driving down the price. He figured he probably wouldn't break even.
What I do, I either make my living from the water, that's it. If that goes, I'm gone.
Every afternoon, Dave's catch is loaded to be shipped to Crisfield. But the ferry boats that go to the mainland bring back something besides groceries these days. Tourists eager to spend an afternoon on the island. Dave says sometimes he and Cecil feel like they're on display.
How can you tell a soft one from a hard one in there? Because we're used to it.
I've had them come right in my place, you know, be in my float part without even asking. And we've said to people, if you caught us in your house, you had a gun, you'd probably shoot us, you know, without asking us in. Even though I cuss sometimes about, about work and all I do here, I still like the lifestyle around here. But what's going to happen, like I say, in 15 to 20 years, I don't know.
It's a story the Driftwood crew had heard over and over again on this trip. The battle between those who want to change things and those who want to hold on to what they've got.
We started our South Atlantic trip in a very highly developed part, which would be South Florida, Fort Lauderdale area, where you're dealing there with a lot of vacationers, a lot of condominiums along the water, a lot of places that have been developed.
It slowly diminishes as you go north to Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina, and finally into Chesapeake Bay, where it's a much slower way of life. And these people like it that way. They're used to it. Their families have lived this kind of life for generations.
The thing that really struck me about traveling on the Waterway was the people that work and pull their living from the water. I really got a great respect for them. They work so hard and have been doing so for so long, and that it's kind of sad to see them actually talk about how they feel it's slipping away.
In the weeks ahead, join the crew of the Driftwood as they travel more than 25,000 miles and rediscover the stories along the waterways that link the people of North America with one another and the rest of the world. Come along as they explore man's relationship with the water he treasures and despoils, plays with and fights with, and cannot live without. Join these young people on the next leg of On the Waterways.
Funding for this program was provided by the Bamana Corporation of Fort Wayne, Indiana.